There is something unsettling about a missing person case in a city. There are cameras, roads, buildings, phones, witnesses, thousands of people moving through the same space. But take that same mystery into the Australian wilderness, and the rules change. A person can leave a road, enter the trees, and become almost impossible to locate. And sometimes, even when police search from the ground and air, even when volunteers comb the terrain, even when investigators know the person's last confirmed location, nothing. No body. No belongings. No final message explaining what happened. Just a boundary on a map where someone's known life seems to stop. Tonight, we're looking at 6 Australians and visitors who disappeared into forests, mountains, and national parks across the country. Their stories are separated by decades and thousands of kilometers, but each contains the same disturbing moment. There was a last known trace, and then there was nothing. The first case takes us back to Tasmania in 1970, when an experienced bushwalker named Dan Cockholm disappeared inside one of Australia's most unforgiving national parks. Cockholm was 24 years old and serving in the Australian Army. He was preparing to leave for Vietnam, but during his pre-deployment leave, he traveled to Tasmania. He wasn't a complete stranger to the outdoors. He planned to walk through Cradle Mountain Lake St. Clair National Park. And remarkably, there is a record of his journey. Cockholm made entries in several mountain hut logbooks as he moved deeper into the park. Then, on April 29th, he left what would become his final known record. He wrote that he was going on to climb Mount Osa. After that, nothing. At the time, police did not initially understand where he had gone. His disappearance was reported weeks later, and authorities even considered the possibility that he had deliberately avoided military service. But later evidence changed the picture. The hut records established that Cockholm really had entered the national park. Searches followed. Years passed. Decades passed. His body was never recovered. In 2015, a Tasmanian coroner concluded that Cockholm had died in the national park, probably after becoming lost or injured near Mount Osa. But the coroner could not determine exactly how he died, and that leaves a strange distinction. His death has effectively been established. His final location has been narrowed down. His movements can be partially reconstructed. Yet the physical evidence that families normally use to understand a death is still missing. Cockholm's case shows one of the fundamental problems with wilderness disappearances. Sometimes investigators aren't searching for a person. They're searching for a tiny object somewhere inside an enormous landscape. And if that object is never found, the story can remain unfinished for generations. But Tasmania wasn't finished with mysteries. More than 4 decades later, another disappearance would produce an entirely different kind of question. In March 2011, American writer Rachel Funari was staying on Bruny Island in Tasmania. She had planned to camp, but bad weather changed those plans. Instead, she stayed at a holiday shack in Adventure Bay. At some point after the people she had been with left, Rachel disappeared. Police quickly focused on the nearby fluted Cape Track, and the landscape explains why. The track runs through dense bushland and along enormous cliffs overlooking the ocean. Some sections are only a short distance from a sheer drop. Rachel had apparently discussed walking in the area, and police believed an accident was the most likely explanation. But if that was what happened, where was the evidence? The search became extensive. Ground crews went through the bush. Helicopters searched from above. At night, infrared equipment was used. Divers searched the waters beneath the cliffs. Climbers examined difficult sections of the coastline. A specialist dog unit was also brought in. Yet investigators couldn't find Rachel. Not her body, not her bag, not her shoes, not even the camera she was believed to have been carrying. ABC later reported that police found no evidence of foul play, and a coroner concluded she probably died somewhere in the bushland or surrounding waters. But probability is not the same thing as proof. For Rachel's family, there was no final scene. No location where they could say, this is where it happened. Just an enormous landscape capable of hiding the smallest piece of evidence. And then came another disappearance in a completely different part of Australia. This time, The missing person wasn't an inexperienced visitor. He was an experienced bushwalker. In October 2019, Niels Becker began a carefully planned solo trek through Victoria's high country. He had prepared for the trip for months. He knew the area. He was considered fit and well-equipped. And unlike some wilderness cases, investigators had a remarkably useful clue: a message. Becker reached Vallejo Gantner Hut and contacted his family. He told them he intended to continue toward Mount Sterling before eventually returning to his vehicle. That message created a destination. It created a direction. It created a rough timeline. Then Becker disappeared. Police launched a major search. But the mountains introduced a problem that is easy to underestimate from a map. A route that looks simple on paper can become completely different when you're standing inside it. Weather can erase tracks. Vegetation can hide a person only meters away. A planned route can become impossible. And in the high country, a wrong turn can put someone into terrain that looks almost identical in every direction. Police considered the possibility that Becker had been delayed by poor weather and then attempted to cover too much ground before darkness. Senior Sergeant Keegan believed Becker may never have reached Mount Sterling. Searchers covered an enormous area. Still nothing. No clear trace. No definitive final location. No answer. ABC reported that police did not believe he made it to Mount Sterling and that heavy weather, including snow and rapidly changing conditions, complicated the search. But there was another detail that makes the case especially difficult. Becker knew the region. He had prepared. He wasn't simply wandering into an unfamiliar forest without a plan. And yet the same wilderness that an experienced person had deliberately entered became the last place anyone could reliably follow him. Then, almost exactly where one mystery had unfolded, another one appeared. This time, the missing man wasn't carrying hiking equipment into the mountains. He was driving. His name was Conrad Whitlock. In July 2019, Whitlock left his home in Melbourne during the early morning hours and drove toward Mount Buller. That decision alone was strange. He was 72. He wasn't known as a backcountry hiker. And his wife knew the mountain well enough to find the trip unusual. But the strangest part came later. His BMW was found near Mount Buller. Inside were his jacket, phone, wallet, and keys. But Whitlock was gone. Investigators were able to reconstruct parts of his journey using cameras and other evidence. His car had arrived in the area. Then it stopped. For a short window of time, there was no passing traffic. And when another vehicle came through, the BMW was empty. That tiny gap became the center of the mystery. What happened during those minutes? Did Whitlock suffer a medical episode? Did he become disoriented? Did he walk away from the road? Did he fall into the dense terrain surrounding it? Or was something else responsible? Police searched the area extensively. The terrain was steep, thick, and difficult. Temperatures dropped below freezing. And Whitlock was not equipped for a prolonged stay in those conditions. Years later, a coroner accepted the conclusion that he likely died around the time of his disappearance, while his body was never recovered. Investigators believed a medical episode and disorientation may have played a role. But even with that conclusion, one question remains painfully simple. Where is he? Because knowing the likely explanation doesn't necessarily tell a family where to look. And sometimes, modern technology doesn't solve that problem. It only makes the mystery stranger. In October 2020, 30-year-old Damon Ness traveled alone to the Northern Territory. He went to Nipmuc National Park near Katherine. At some point on October 20th, Ness went for a walk. He never returned. Police found his vehicle at the Nipmuc Gorge Car Park. That gave investigators a starting point. And unlike decades earlier, the search now had access to tools that previous generations could barely imagine. Ground teams, helicopters, drones, water searches, park staff, emergency personnel. Over several days, dozens of people worked through the area, but Damon Ness wasn't found. Northern Territory Police eventually suspended the active search while keeping the case open. Think about what that means. The disappearance happened in the age of satellite navigation, mobile phones, aircraft, drones, and sophisticated search coordination. And still, the wilderness could produce the same result it had produced decades earlier. A vehicle, a last known location, a search, and silence. But perhaps the most disturbing case in this story isn't the one with the most mysterious circumstances. It's the one where the disappearance appears to have been connected to something far darker. Her name was Trudy Adams. In June 1978, 19-year-old Trudy Adams left a dance at the Newport Surf Life-Saving Club in Sydney. She was last seen leaving alone. According to NSW's police, she has never contacted family or friends since. At first, this could have been another missing person investigation. But then investigators began finding something disturbing. Other women reported remarkably similar attacks in the area. Women described being picked up around Sydney's northern beaches, taken toward the bushland of Ku-ring-gai Chase National Park, threatened, restrained, and assaulted. Police eventually connected numerous assaults to the same general pattern. That transformed Trudy's disappearance. It was no longer simply a teenager who had vanished somewhere near a national park. Investigators believed she may have encountered the same people responsible for a series of attacks. And suddenly, the forest wasn't simply the last known environment. It may have been part of the crime itself. The case was reopened decades later. A dedicated strike force investigated. A major reward was offered. And investigators continued to pursue information long after the original officers had left the force. Yet Trudy's remains have never been recovered. NSW's police still lists her as missing, and official records continue to identify her disappearance as unresolved. That is what makes her story different from the others. In Kokholm's case, investigators eventually reached a conclusion about his death. In Rachel Funari's case, an accident became the leading explanation. For Becker and Ness, wilderness survival and accidental death remain possibilities. For Whitlock, investigators and a coroner developed a likely explanation involving disorientation and a medical event. But Trudy's case carries another possibility. That somebody knows what happened. Somebody may have known for decades. And if that is true, the forest isn't keeping the secret by itself. A human being is. 6 disappearances, 6 different landscapes, 6 different sets of circumstances. And yet there is one detail connecting them all. The last trace is always surprisingly ordinary. A hut logbook, a walking trail, a text message, a car, a parked vehicle, a dance ending in the early hours of the morning. Nothing about those final moments looks like the beginning of a mystery. That is what makes them so disturbing. There is no dramatic boundary where a person disappears. There is simply a point beyond which nobody knows what happened. And Australia's wilderness makes that point especially difficult to cross. Because the bush is not an empty place. It only looks empty from a distance. Underneath the canopy are gullies, cliffs, rivers, fallen trees, rock faces, caves, ravines, and dense vegetation. Weather can change in minutes. A person can become disoriented. A phone can lose signal. A trail can split. A vehicle can stop somewhere unexpected. And a search team can pass close to the answer without knowing it. That doesn't mean the wilderness is supernatural. It doesn't require monsters, mysterious creatures, or impossible explanations. The reality is more unsettling. Sometimes ordinary events become impossible to reconstruct because the environment destroys the evidence. A fall, exposure, disorientation, a medical emergency, a wrong turn, or, in cases like Trudy Adams, possibly something deliberate. The result can look almost identical from the outside. Someone goes in, they don't come back, and the evidence never arrives. There is also an important lesson hidden inside these cases. A disappearance is not necessarily a mystery because nobody searched. Sometimes the opposite is true. People searched for days, sometimes weeks. Sometimes years later, investigators returned with new technology and new theories. In Rachel Funari's case, land, sea, and air searches produced nothing. In Damon Ness's case, authorities used ground teams, aircraft, drones, and water searches. In Conrad Whitlock's case, investigators reconstructed his movements and still could not recover his body. And in Dan Cockholm's case, it took decades before investigators could even reconstruct his final movements through old hut records. That is the cruel mathematics of a wilderness disappearance. The search can be enormous, the clue can be tiny, and the distance between those two things can be only a few meters. For the families, however, the uncertainty is not measured in meters. It is measured in years. They don't simply lose a person. They lose the certainty of what happened to that person. There is no final location, no confirmed final moment. Sometimes not even a grave, just a name attached to a file. And somewhere beyond the last confirmed sighting, there is an unanswered question. What happened next? Maybe one day, someone will find the missing object. A hiker will notice something beneath the vegetation. A new forensic technique will reveal something old investigators couldn't see. Someone who knows more will finally decide to speak. Or another search team will walk into the same landscape and discover what everyone before them missed. That has happened before. Because forests change, technology changes, investigations change, and memories change. But until the final evidence appears, the question remains exactly where it began. Not in the middle of the forest, not at the edge of a cliff, not beside an abandoned car. It begins with the last confirmed moment. A person was here, then they weren't. And somewhere between those two facts is the part of the story Australia still hasn't been able to recover.